Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
Some artists don't want to tell you their name though, right? Like Destiny's Child. We don't know her name. We know her mother's name. Destiny. But we don't know hers, and she's the nerve to sing that song, Say My Name. But we don't know your name. Unless it's Destiny Jr., I am completely in the dark on this. No wonder they want us to pay their bills. They don't have names. How are you going to sign a check if you don't have a name? Question? Some artists don't want to tell you that.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, August the 8th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer, the patriotic song of the day, and the headlines, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and bad news. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Well, old Daniel saw that storm. That was you. Daniel saw the storm that came rolling in the Babylon. And Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain coming down to the deep mighty world. Well, old Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain. Daniel saw the storm that came rolling in the Babylon. And Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain coming down to the deep mighty world. Well, I would not live a liar. Well, I'll tell you the reason why. I'm afraid my Lord might call me, and I wouldn't be ready to die. Well, old Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain. Daniel saw the storm that came rolling in the Babylon. Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain coming down to the deep mighty world. Well, old Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain. Daniel saw the storm that came rolling in the Babylon. Daniel saw the storm. That was you. Down the mountain coming down to the deep mighty world. Well, the tree, it was bending way up in the heavenly land. Well, my God said to the Holy Ghost, he said, come on and let's make man. Well, good Lord, in the morning. Well, I'm looking for the storm. Down the mountain, looking for the storm that came rolling in the Babylon. I'm looking for the storm that was you. Down the mountain coming down to the deep mighty world. Well, I found that storm. Down the mountain, that came rolling in the Babylon. I found that storm that was you. Down the mountain coming down to the deep mighty world.
Thank you. And now, the headlines, of course.
Mahek Cook, Lee Carter. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow. Morning Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
All right, good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. It's called volatility, sharp ups and downs for stocks. Traders like it. Nobody else does, and it's not over. Wednesday started out with solid gains and closed with another sharp decline. Today, the market's reacted to initial jobless claims. Those numbers, anything to do with jobs can move the market. Just 233,000 jobless claims, fewer than expected. That suggests the economy is not too weak. Investors like it. The Dow's going to open with a gain of about 130. And look at that NASDAQ go, up nearly 200 points. These are pre-market quotes. The market opens in a half hour. Interesting movement in Treasury yields. The 10-year and the 2-year, both right at 4%. Got the 10-year at 3.99. Show me the 2-year, because that's around just over 4%. Now you're at 4.05. How about that? Bitcoin gaining some ground as well. It's moving up to 57,009 as we speak. Politics. J.D. Vance takes his campaign straight to the vice president, or he tries to. He marches down the tarmac at an airport in Wisconsin, right next to Harris's Air Force Two plane, and demands she answers questions. He missed her. Her motorcade had just departed. After her Wisconsin event, Harris said her goal was to bring down prices on day one. When the event was over, she refused to answer reporters' shouted questions. It's now 18 days with no press conference. Trump, well, he's doing the exact opposite. He will hold a full press conference at 2 p.m. Eastern today from Mar-a-Lago. On the show, 2 tax cut proposals from Trump, no tax on Social Security benefits and no tax on tips. Both appeal to large groups of voters, politically astute. And we're on Biden watch. He rarely appears in public. He left the campaign because of his obvious decline, but he's still the president for another 6 months. We need to see and hear the commander-in-chief to confirm he's still doing the job. He leaves for his beach house this afternoon. The terror threat hits home. 3 Taylor Swift concerts in Vienna cancelled. The authorities uncovered an ISIS plan to use explosives and knives to kill as many concert goers as possible. Thursday, August 8th, 2024.
And that was the headlines. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now some Mafia action.
A lot of Colombo made guys and a lot of associates were walking on that line. They weren't happy about it. They said, look, what are we doing here? We're auditioning for the FBI. They're taking photos of us. They're seeing us. They're knowing who we are. There was a lot of dissension about walking on that line from made guys who were used to kind of staying in the shadows, staying undercover. I started to hear some rumbling about Joe Colombo, so on and so forth. And I'll never forget, there was a guy, Jewish guy, by the name of Artie Antrata. We called him Artie the Animal. And I heard him one day say, you know what are we doing here? We're marching. I haven't heard a word about my man Sonny. Nobody's trying to help him. How come they're not marching in for him? How come they're not mentioning his name? This is all about Joe Colombo, so on and so forth. And one of the other made guys said, hey, Artie, don't talk like that, keep it down. People hear that, they'll get the wrong impression. You might have some trouble. Artie said, I don't care. I love Sonny and I'm only here for... I could have at some point and said, I'm done. This is not for me. I don't want to do this. This is not the direction that I had planned in my life. My father would have probably said, okay. Wouldn't have forced me, wouldn't have made me get into it. But I said, no, if this is what he wants, this is what I'm going to do. And people have said to me, do you regret making that decision? I don't look back and have regrets like that because it was such a life-changing experiences. I went through what I went through, and I regret certain things that I did as a result of that life, of being involved in that life. I certainly regret hurting my family, being in prison for 8 years, putting my family through so many struggles and so many challenges as a result of the things that I did. I regret at times that people got hurt and I knew about it and I was involved in things. So of course, you regret certain things.
And that was a little bit of Mafia. Thank you. And now the military shorts.
The new Army commander at Fort Huachuca in Sierra Vista, Arizona, was known for his strict rules. Among them was that his men weren't allowed to be seen in town while wearing combat uniforms. He even prohibited soldiers from leaving their car to pick up food if they were in their fatigues. For the soldiers at Fort Huachuca, it was a mild inconvenience. But for the McDonald's owner near the base, it was threatening to put him out of business. In the autumn of 1974, 90% of their customers had been soldiers from the military base. But by January of 75, business had plummeted to nearly nothing as the edict took effect. If we don't do something quickly, we'll be out of business, the owner told his wife in a panic. Then knock a hole in the wall and serve them in their cars, she nonchalantly blurted to him. That way, they're not breaking the rules. So he did. And on January 28, 1975, 4 uniformed soldiers from Fort Huachuca became the first McDonald's drive-thru customers.
Cops hate 2 things. They hate the way things are and they hate change. So if you're going to change something on a cop, they get a little uncomfortable with it. When we were going to shift guns, we let them shoot everything. SIGs, Glock, M&P, and they almost picked the SIG.
Really?
Yeah, I think it was barely by one guy we ended up back with Glock. And I think it was probably more comfort than anything. I think ultimately in the end, that's probably what got us back with Glock was the fact that they didn't want to change.
Makes sense. They just sent me this, the P226, the new one.
Yes, I've seen it.
Whoa. I carried the old school double action one back in the SEAL teams. They totally revamped it. The thing is a tack driver. It is amazing.
And that was the shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of motivation.
Small daily acts of improvement, when done consistently over time, lead to staggering results.
Some of y'all soft. There's no better word for it. You're soft. You want to be a champion, but you don't want to work like a champion. Show up. A real man in the dark, when nobody's watching, he putting in work.
The heart of a champion is a light switch that's always on. It doesn't go on and off when someone's watching. It's constant. Every single one of you has an opportunity every single day to make these small daily acts of excellence, optimization, and creativity that will ultimately build a life of greatness. How do you build a great company? It's not by revolution, it's by evolution. How do you build a legendary life? It's about what you do every single day with utter consistency that over time creates mastery.
If you go to the gym and you work out and you come back and you look in the mirror, you will see nothing. And if you go to the gym the next day and you come back and you look in the mirror, you will see nothing. So clearly there's no results, can't be measured, it must not be effective. So we quit. Or if you fundamentally believe that this is the right course of action and you stick with it, I'm not exactly sure what day, but I know you'll start getting into shape.
You will never pick up any momentum because you keep doing something different every single day. You have to find a routine and stick with it. If you hit a tree 1,000 times in 1,000 different spots, there's no guarantee it's going to fall. But if you hit a tree 1,000 times in that same exact spot, it's going to come to the ground. Your problem is you did hit it 1,000 times, but in 1,000 different places. Stop trying to be deep. I need you to do the exact same thing every single day for the next 10, 15, 20 years and watch that tree come down. Every single day, stick with it. Don't rush the process. Trust the process. Don't rush the process. Trust the process. Don't rush the process. Trust the process. Get that one thing you're good at. Get that one thing you're passionate at and stick with it. Stop starting and stopping and starting and stopping and starting and stopping. If you master one thing, if you get there, I'm telling you, you can have what you want.
You can screw it up. You can skip a day or two.
Yeah, out of 365 days, you will have a bad day or two. But I'm trying to tell you, the strength is in the routine.
What are you supposed to do when you fall off the path like that? What action should you take? Should you sit there and dwell and think about it forever? No. When you fall off the path, what you do is you get right back on the path. The path of responsibility, hard work, and sacrifice. The path of discipline, humility, and ownership that ultimately leads to freedom. You think things are gonna just go your way? Well, they're not gonna just go your way. You think things are gonna just happen for you? Well, they're not just gonna happen for you. You gotta make them happen.
You do whatever it takes. You have to eat the dream. You have to sleep the dream. You have to dream the dream. You have to see it when nobody else sees it. You have to feel it when it's not tangible. You have to believe it when you cannot see it. You gotta be possessed with the dream. And every single day, you gotta wake up and put forth effort. And your grind has to match your dream. You can't play as much as you used to play. You can't go where you used to go. You can't do what you used to do. And now you gotta push your grind up to match your dream. I need you to pick your grind up. I need you to pick your grind up. There's nothing wrong with your dream. You have a great dream, but your grind does not affect your dream. You gotta build that momentum. Sometimes it ain't about being the most talented. Sometimes it ain't about being the smartest. Sometimes it's not even about working the hardest. Sometimes it's about consistency. Just keep doing it and keep doing it. You keep doing it and never stop. You never give up and never quit. Day after day, play after play, second after second. When you get to a place where you work and you take your work serious and you put some consistency with your work, when you put so much time in, so much effort in, that what happens is your work starts to work for you. The effort that you put forth, the things that you do, because of the work you put in, things just start happening for you. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. Stay predictable. Stay consistent. And when you embrace the grind will reward you.
The process of getting better and becoming the best at what it is that you do is painful. It's excruciating. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. And there's a reason why there is the phrase growing pains. Losers want to be coddled. They want to be comfortable. Winners want to be pushed and put through the pain because they know that going through that pain is going to produce the best possible product in themselves. So which one of these people are you? Are your feelings so delicate and so sensitive that you're going to let you getting your little delicate feelings hurt get in the way of becoming what it is you wish to become? Or do you say, you know what, my ego. There's no pain, there's no f***ing gain. Which one of those people are you? Because I can tell you one is going to always be average and one is going to always end up being elite.
In order to get a breakthrough, no breaks. You gotta grind, grind, grind. You gotta go through setbacks and disappointments. You gotta go through it. So it's not gonna be easy, but I'd rather take my breakthrough than to take a break. I need you to power through it. I need you to pray through it. I need you to encourage yourself through it. I need you to do whatever it takes. Because if you don't take a break, I promise you, your breakthrough is coming.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
On being invincible. Who then is invincible? The one who cannot be upset by anything outside their reasoned choice. Epictetus, Discourses 1.18.21. Have you ever watched a seasoned pro handle the media? No question is too tough, no tone too pointed or insulting. They parry every blow with humor, poise, and patience. Even when stung or provoked, they choose not to flinch or react. They're able to do this not only because of training and experience, but because they understand that reacting emotionally will only make the situation worse. The media is waiting for them to slip up or get upset. So, to successfully navigate press events, they have internalized the importance of keeping themselves under calm control. It's unlikely you'll face a horde of probing reporters bombarding you with insensitive questions today, but it might be helpful, whatever stresses or frustrations or overload that do come your way, to picture that image and use it as your model for dealing with them. Our reasoned choice, our prohairesis, as the Stoics called it, is a kind of invincibility that we can cultivate. We can shrug off hostile attacks and breeze through pressure or problems. And, like our model, when we finish, we can point back into the crowd and say, "Next."
And that was the Daily Stoic. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
What burdens us? What's the burden of life? It's this old lie that we will become happy if we just get enough of the goods of the world. If we can just draw enough into ourselves and hang on to it, then I'll be happy. I will not be happy. On the contrary. What do we all want? Well, this lovely word here, rest, it doesn't mean like lying in a hammock. It means fulfillment. It means peace. It means the joy that we all want. How do you get it? You get it by imitating the rhythms and dynamics of the divine life. Come to me, the Lord says. All you who are burdened by this lie you've been told, and in me you'll find rest.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, "The precondition of a civilized society is the barring of physical forces from social relationships, thus establishing the principle that if men wish to deal with one another, they may do so only by means of reason, by discussion, persuasion, and voluntary, uncoerced agreement." Unquote. And that was Ayn Rand from The Nature of Government, from the book The Virtue of Selfishness. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War, Chapter 31, Destroy from Within.
The Invisible Enemy. Late in 1933, Adolf Hitler appointed the 46-year-old Rear Admiral Wilhelm Canaris chief of the Abwehr, the secret intelligence and counterespionage service of the German General Staff. Hitler had recently won dictatorial powers as the ruler of Germany, and with an eye on future conquests in Europe, he wanted Canaris to make the Abwehr an agency as efficient as the British Secret Service. Canaris was a slightly odd choice for the position. He came from the aristocracy, was not a member of the Nazi Party, and had not had a particularly outstanding military career. But Hitler saw traits in Canaris that would make him a superior spymaster. Cunning in the extreme, a man made for intrigue and deception, he knew how to get results. He would also owe his promotion exclusively to Hitler. In the years to come, Hitler would have reason to feel proud of his choice. Canaris rigorously reorganized the Abwehr and extended its spy networks throughout Europe. Then, in May 1940, he provided exceptional intelligence for the Blitzkrieg invasion of France and the Low Countries early in World War II. And so in the summer of that same year, Hitler gave Canaris his most important task to date: providing intelligence for Operation Sea Lion, a plan to conquer England. After the Blitzkrieg and the evacuation of the Allied army at Dunkirk, the British seemed deeply vulnerable, and knocking them out of the war at this point would ensure Hitler's conquest of Europe. A few weeks into the job, however, Canaris reported that the Germans had underestimated the size of the English army and air force. Sea Lion would require resources much larger than the Führer had anticipated. Unless Hitler was willing to commit many more troops, it could turn into a mess. This was highly disappointing news for Hitler, who had wanted to knock out England in one quick blow. With his eye on an imminent invasion of Russia, he was unwilling to commit large numbers to Sea Lion or to spend years subduing the British. Having come to trust Canaris, he abandoned the planned invasion. That same summer, General Alfred Jodl came up with a brilliant plan to damage England in another way. Using Spain as a base of operations, he would invade the British-owned island of Gibraltar, cutting off England's sea routes through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal to its empire in India and points east. A disastrous blow. But the Germans would have to act fast before the English caught on to the threat. Excited by the prospect of ruining England in this indirect way, Hitler once again asked Canaris to assess the plan. The Abwehr chief went to Spain, studied the situation, and reported back. The moment a German army moved into Spain, he said, the English would see the plan, and Gibraltar had elaborate defenses. The Germans would also need the cooperation of Francisco Franco, dictator of Spain, who Canaris believed would not be sufficiently helpful. In short, Gibraltar was not worth the effort. There were many around Hitler who believed that taking Gibraltar was eminently realizable and could mean overall victory in the war against Britain. Shocked at Canaris's report, they vocally expressed their doubts about the intelligence he had been providing all along. His enigmatic nature, he spoke little and was impossible to read, only fueled their suspicions that he was not to be trusted. Hitler heard his staff out, but a meeting with Generalissimo Franco to discuss the Gibraltar plan indirectly corroborated everything Canaris had said. Franco was difficult and made all kinds of silly demands. The Spanish would be impossible to deal with. The logistics were too complicated. Hitler quickly lost interest in Jodl's plan. In the years that followed, German officials in increasing numbers would come to suspect Canaris of disloyalty to the Third Reich, but no one could pin anything concrete on him. And Hitler himself had great faith in the Abwehr chief and sent him on critical top-secret missions. One such assignment occurred in the summer of 1943 when Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the former chief of the Italian General Staff, who arrested Benito Mussolini, dictator of Italy and Hitler's staunchest ally. The Germans feared that Badoglio might secretly open talks with General Dwight D. Eisenhower for Italy's surrender, a devastating blow to the Axis that Hitler could forestall if necessary by sending an army to Rome, arresting Badoglio, and occupying the capital. But was it necessary? Hitler's armies were needed elsewhere, so Canaris was dispatched to assess the likelihood of Italy's surrender. He met with his counterpart in the Italian government, General Cesare Aimé, then arranged for a meeting between high-ranking members of both countries' intelligence services. At the meeting, Aimé emphatically denied that Badoglio had any intention of betraying Germany. In fact, the Marshal was fiercely loyal to the cause, and Aimé was very convincing. Hitler accordingly left Italy alone. A few weeks later, however, Badoglio indeed surrendered to Eisenhower, and the valuable Italian fleet moved into Allied hands. Canaris had been fooled. Or was it Canaris who had done the fooling? General Walter Schellenberg, chief of the Foreign Intelligence Branch of the SS, began to investigate the Badoglio fiasco and found two men in Aimé's service who had listened in on one of Canaris' talks with their boss. Canaris, they reported, had known of Badoglio's intentions to surrender all along and had collaborated with Aimé to deceive Hitler. Surely this time the Abwehr chief had been caught in the act and would pay with his life. Schellenberg accumulated a thick dossier of other actions that cast more doubts on Canaris. He presented it to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who, however, told his subordinate to keep quiet. He would present the dossier to Hitler when the time was right. Yet to Schellenberg's dismay, months went by, and Himmler did nothing, except eventually to retire Canaris with honors from the service. Shortly after Canaris' retirement, his diaries fell into the hands of the SS. They revealed that he had conspired against Hitler from the beginning of his service as Abwehr chief, even plotting to assassinate the Führer in schemes that had only barely misfired. Canaris was sent to a concentration camp, where, in April 1945, he was tortured and killed.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War from Chapter 31, Destroy from Within. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because today's society increasingly divests itself of the negativity of the other or the foreign. The process of globalization accelerates the dissolution of borders and distinctions. Yet, the depletion of negativity should not be equated with the disappearance of violence, since along with the violence of negativity, there's a violence of positivity, which is wielded without enmity or domination. Violence isn't merely an excess of negativity. It can also be an excess of positivity, the accumulation of the positive, which manifests as overachievement, overproduction, overcommunication, hyperattention, and hyperactivity. The violence of positivity is possibly even more disastrous than that of negativity because it is neither visible nor evident, and it evades immunological defense because of its positivity. Infection, invasion, and infiltration, which are characteristic of the violence of negativity, now give way to infarction. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Jamie Raskin is a congressman from Maryland, a Democrat congressman. And so I want you to listen to this clip and listen to the tone of voice.
It's necessary, but it's not sufficient because what can be put into the...
Let's try it again.
Again, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient because what can be put into the Constitution can slip away from you very quickly. And the greatest example going on right now before our very eyes is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which they're just disappearing with a magic wand, as if it doesn't exist, even though it could not be clearer what it's stating. And so, they want to kick it to Congress, so it's going to be up to us on January 6, 2025 to tell the rampaging Trump mobs that he's disqualified. And then we need bodyguards for everybody and Civil War conditions. And
so, and he goes on for another 30 seconds or so, but, it's just where he whines about the Supreme Court. But what you need to listen to is the tone of voice. The left does this all the time, where they'll sell things with tone of voice. He has a very confident, very calm tone of voice where he acts as though this is a fait accompli, as though this decision is up to him and him alone. And he does this because he knows that it's going to make people mad. That's the purpose of it. It's to bait you and I into throwing a temper tantrum. Okay, we don't have to. Some of us may choose to do so, but you just need to know that this is a trick. They're baiting you, and you don't have to play along. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I was listening to the John Cobelt show, and he was talking about, one of the reasons I like his show is that he talks about local stuff that's going on in LA County, and the state of California. Most other people are national and international. And so anyways, he's talking about the metro and all the problems we're having on our metro system. For those of you that are overseas here in LA, all the trains are a mess because of the perfectionism of our public officials. They want to get the what they call the homeless, I call the squatters and trespassers, off the streets and out of the metro, the buses, the trains, etc. But the problem is they're looking for something, they're looking for perfect. They're looking for the perfect answer, perfect solution. And so they have to get all their stakeholders together and do surveys and polls, and it takes forever to get anything done. And then what they do manage to get done is unbelievably expensive. $700,000 per unit for an apartment complex for people that are on the street. So that kind of thing. So that's why we're stuck with homeless people that are fouling the metro. So if you're coming here for a vacation or something like that, you want to be aware of that. The red line, the gold line, all these lines are subject to, you're going to get on them, you're going to find, first thing you're going to do is say, what's that smell? And there's a homeless person that's probably sleeping on this particular road, and they're violent. They're very often fly into psychotic rages. We've had a story just today about a woman that was assaulted and was taken to the hospital in stable condition. And a lot of these folks are repeat offenders. They've been violent in the past. But again, all of this, and then they start making excuses, which is just another way of saying we can't, right? Because really, when you're looking at this from a Democrat and left-wing standpoint, the left wing is proud of being possibility thinkers, and they hire the people to be mayors and county supervisors, etc., that are going to be possibility thinkers. They're going to think outside the box, and they're going to come up with creative solutions and get things done. But instead, all they do is offer excuses. In some cases, they even give up. Gavin Newsom, he's a Democrat, he's a left-wing Democrat, and he has given up on the homeless, the so-called homeless problem. He says it's intransigent. So he's just given up on it. That's not possibility thinking. And that's why they're hired. That's why the left hires these people. You guys on the left, you hire these people because you expect them to be possibility thinkers and to come up with creative solutions and get things done. You know, to break through barriers, not to sit and say, oh, well, we don't have the budget for it. Find the money. That's why you're hired. But they're not doing it. So if the left should be telling Karen Bass, hey, look, if you're too befuddled to get this done, if you're not a possibility thinker after all, then you need to quit. And we'll put in place somebody who is a possibility thinker who will get this done. Back in a minute. Thank you. So Kamala Harris is unbelievably unpopular. First of all, she can't get the vice presidential candidate that she wants, Shapiro, because he doesn't want to have anything to do with her. And now the news media doesn't even like Kamala Harris because they won't go ahead and sit with her for an interview. They won't do a press conference with her. And so, I mean, that's pretty bad. When the news media doesn't want to have anything to do with you, you know you're unpopular. On the other hand, with Donald Trump, the news media follows him around all the time. They end up asking a lot of stupid questions, but they like Donald Trump. And everybody likes Donald Trump. He's a popular guy. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, bad news. How woke media is undermining democracy. And this is Chapter 3, A Status Revolution.
Chapter 3, A Status Revolution. Even up until very recently, journalists were not part of the American elite. In 1937, the social scientist and writer Leo C. Roston did a survey of the top journalists of his time, 127 Washington correspondents. He found that less than half of them had finished college. 3 in 10 had attended college for a year or two, 8 hadn't finished high school, and 2 of them had no high school education at all, like Benjamin Day before them. A more extensive study from earlier in the decade found that just 40% of journalists were college grads and nearly 10% hadn't gone to high school. 2/3 came from working-class families. In the early times, we were not only describing the life of normal people, we were participating in it. Richard Harwood, a longtime Washington Post reporter and former Marine, told James Fallows, author of Breaking the News. Most of the reporters came from the lower middle class, which is where the readers and most of the subjects came from too. We were more or less on the same level with the people we dealt with. We lived in the same neighborhood. Reporters regarded themselves as working class. This was not false modesty. Journalism was a high working class job, more a blue collar trade than a profession. Your average journalist earned about the same as the average cop, even those who had gone to college, which was by no means the norm. In making the choice for journalism, the college boys knew that their earnings would be nowhere close to what their classmates were making on Madison Ave or with General Motors, writes Fallows. This gave reporters an instinctive pro-little guy outlook. Not that long ago, a lot of jobs in journalism were basically blue-collar jobs, even in the newsroom. Never mind the printers and truck drivers and all those folks, Christopher Daly told me. When I started out in the 1970s in a small-town newspaper, I'd say about half the staff did not have a college degree, and no one was making a lot of money. This wasn't a high-paying job. Journalism still isn't one of America's most lucrative professions. But there has been a status revolution from blue-collar job to elite and even celebrity status. That's been a sea change in American journalism, Daly said. Now I think it's really hard to imagine someone not having a college degree. The sea change began in the 1950s, and it's impacted a much broader swath of American society than just journalists. After World War II, returning veterans took advantage of the GI Bill to go to college, which made having a college degree far more ubiquitous. In turn, this meant that a degree could no longer be used as a status symbol, which elevated the importance of going to a better college and even graduate school. A college education became both a major marker of class in American society and a source of class anxiety. You had to go to the right college where you met the right kind of people. The educational divide quickly began to show up in politics. The educated class supported things like busing and affirmative action and were appalled to find opposition from the working class white families who would be the most affected by these proposals, while the affluent sent their children to private schools. College students protesting the Vietnam War learned to feel disdain for the workers and cops who supported the war and who inevitably ended up fighting in it. The response of the hard hats and the police fed a growing division between student and worker that was part of a growing class separation in a country that had liked to think of itself as classless. writes Charles Peters in his 2017 book, We Do Our Part. The class divide was entrenched by the rise of John F. Kennedy and, perhaps even more importantly, his wife, Jackie Bouvier Kennedy, who played a big role in paving the way for a rising meritocratic class by providing a bridge between the old money social register elite that she was a part of and the newly developing educated elite that Kennedy represented. These two competing forms of upper-crust Americana merged in the Kennedys, fomenting a potent brew of glamour that attracted celebrities, which drew in other educated elites and brought about the increase in class anxiety and pretensions that always accompanies two classes colliding. Educated Americans started to lean into class markers like travel, food, wine, and art for the satisfaction of feeling like one of the Kennedy clan, and perhaps even more importantly, for the satisfaction of feeling superior to those who didn't have access to such trappings and the vicarious prestige they were believed to bestow. As part of this development, a new breed of reporter, highly educated and socially aspirational, was elevated by JFK, who had worked on the Harvard Crimson, the school's student newspaper, and treated his fellow Ivy League journalists as kindred spirits, flattering them into being loyal to him. He was so deft at this that reporters would later refer to the presidential candidate as Jack, cheering his speeches and singing anti-Nixon songs with Kennedy's staffers at hotel bars, writes Timothy Krause in his book about campaign journalism, The Boys on the Bus. He knew many of them socially, and he was careful to treat them with respect and affection, Krause explains. His Harvard-trained advisors spoke in an academic, sophisticated idiom that excluded many of the older reporters, but appealed to the new generation. Their stock in the profession soared. At the same time, the rise of television meant that there was another, better medium for Americans looking for a stenographic account of what had happened on a given day, one that was more immediate, both temporally and sensually. Newspaper owners felt that they could no longer simply tell their readers what had happened. They had to add something, which put a premium on expertise, analysis, and colorful writing. These became staples of newspaper writing and created a demand for reporters with ever more education and expertise, and devalued the work of less educated reporters and editors. Radio and TV also started to give the news a more national character, breaking down regional barriers by bringing images and newscasters from the major cities into the homes of Americans throughout the nation. What this meant was that influence was concentrated in the hands of an ever smaller, ever more coastal set. The issues that preoccupied editors and producers in New York and Washington were now those that preoccupied the nation at large. But the thing that really jump-started the status revolution in journalism was the Watergate scandal and, just as importantly, its treatment in the Hollywood film All the President's Men. The movie suddenly made journalism seem like a very glamorous endeavor. At its peak, a David and Goliath tale where plucky sexpots, played by Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, could bring down the most powerful and most unpopular man on the planet. The journalism profession began to draw more ambitious and better educated people than ever before. People who would have otherwise gone into other professions, but were drawn to the combination of purpose and fame that journalism now offered. Christopher Daly was in college when the Watergate scandal broke. He was a public school kid from Massachusetts who got a spot at Harvard where he worked on the Crimson. And he noticed the change as it was happening. More and more of his cohort, the graduating class of 1976, were choosing to stay in journalism after college, which represented a marked shift from the past. A lot of guys like Jack Kennedy or Franklin Roosevelt, they had been on the Crimson staff, but that was not going to be their career. It was just something to do during college, Daly recalled. Staying in journalism had been the exception rather than the rule. What shifted after Watergate was seeing the power of an institution like the Washington Post to go up against the Nixon administration and, you could argue, to prevail over the president's power. That seemed like a really cool thing. And I think that attracted more college-educated journalists from the Ivies and other top schools to stay in the field. It created a feedback loop where better educated people became reporters and demanded more money, whereupon even more educated people applied. Across the field of journalism, Watergate provided a jolt, writes Daily in Covering America. In its way, journalism suddenly seemed very glamorous, and it started drawing people who were more ambitious and better educated than ever before. People who would have otherwise gone into other professions started migrating to journalism, a trend that meant pretty much the end of reporting as a blue-collar job. Instead, a new generation brought professional aspirations and lifestyles, which spelled the end of most of the smoking and hard drinking as well. If, during Richard Harwood's early days in Nashville, reporters had living standards slightly higher than those of their neighbors, the factory workers, by the 1980s, reporters in big cities had living standards slightly lower than those of their neighbors, the lawyers and corporate middle managers, writes Fallows. It became an oddity to find a reporter or editor who had not gone to college. At big newspapers, it became unusual to find editors and star writers who were not from very prestigious colleges. In the 1930s, just 3 in 10 journalists had finished college. By 1960, it was 2/3. A third of reporters and editors still hadn't been to college, even just for a year or two. By 1983, the number of American journalists who had completed college jumped to 75%. By 1992, it was 82% of all journalists. By 2002, it was 89%. And by 2015, just 8% of all journalists hadn't been to college, a number that is certainly even smaller today. Meanwhile, the number of Americans with a bachelor's degree remains at just about a third of the population. 46% of adults have never attended a single college class. Already by 1980, American journalists had tightened into an elite caste, as a survey by 3 social scientists revealed. S. Robert Lichter, Stanley Rothman, and Linda S. Lichter found that by that time, journalism had undergone a rapid rise to social prominence. What was once a source of upward mobility for high school grads had morphed into an elite profession for the highly educated. Surveying a random sample of journalists from America's leading national media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, and the 3 commercial TV networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, the scientists discovered that journalists were in fact one of the best educated groups in America. 93% of those they surveyed had college degrees, and the majority had graduate degrees too. Just 1 in 5 reported having fathers with what researchers called low-status jobs, and their salaries in 1986 put leading journalists solidly in the upper middle class, with those at the top making much, much more, and even taking on the status of celebrities. The sociologists also found that in 1980, 90% of journalists were pro-choice, compared to 31% of the public, and 80% supported affirmative action for Black Americans, compared to 57% of the nation. Just 26% of journalists had voted for Ronald Reagan in the 1984 election, and 86% said they seldom or never went to religious services. The staffs at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times were more secular and liberal than journalists from other papers. Lichter, Rothman, and Lichter also wanted to know just how much journalists' liberal views influenced their writing. There were some easy ways to measure this, like counting the liberal versus conservative sources journalists used in their stories. Among the media elite, liberal sources predominated by a 3-to-1 margin. But they also used a test called the thematic apperception test, in which the researcher shows their subjects a series of pictures of ambiguous social situations. The subjects are then asked to tell a fictional story about the picture. The sociologists then compared the journalists' fictional stories to those of a group of businessmen to see if there were any statistically significant differences between the two. And they found that there were. The journalists were much more likely to craft tales of authority figures abusing their power than were the businessmen. They were also more likely to express anger at the characters they decided were abusing their power. In one photo, the journalists were significantly more likely than the businessmen to identify a boxer standing in a shadowed background as being black, and to portray him as fighting against poverty or exploited by a crooked manager. They waxed poetic about the boxer's fight for racial equality and the racism of his opponent, pictured in the foreground. And they imposed poverty and hardship into another photo too, one of a young black boy leaning back in a child-sized chair and reading a book in his study while an older black man sits next to him. Although nothing in the picture suggests they are poor, poverty is a fairly common theme, the researchers found. He was 40, a black man from Atlanta, and all the old crimes of the past stayed with him, was a typical narrative the journalist drummed up to describe the smiling, bearded black man sitting amiably with a child. They found that journalists are significantly more likely than businessmen to apply themes of racial or social disadvantage, with 62% of journalists doing so in relation to these pictures compared to just 38% of businessmen. They also found that journalists rated higher in narcissistic attribution than businessmen. Moreover, the sociologists found that journalists were getting more and more liberal with every new generation. Among journalists 50 and older, 43% said they were left of center and 23% said they were right of center. Of journalists between the ages of 35 and 50, 52% identified as being on the left, but just 16% as conservative. And in the post-Watergate generation, 70% identified as liberals, while just 13% said they were conservatives. And when they looked at the incoming group of journalists who were then attending journalism school, they found the trend continued. Over 85% identified as liberals, while just 11% identified as conservatives. As a group, the students were even more homogenous than the journalists whose ranks they would be joining. They came from even higher income families and more cosmopolitan areas and were even less religious than their elders in the profession. The basic sociological profile of journalists at national news outlets is clear, Lichter, Rothman, and Lichter concluded. They are a largely homogeneous group that is cosmopolitan in background and liberal in outlook, and they are an elite in terms of economic status, public perception, and social influence. It was nothing short of a revolution, the sociologists concluded. Yesteryear's ragtag muckrakers who tirelessly championed the little guy against powerful insiders have become insiders themselves, they wrote. Newsmen had long cherished the vantage point of the outsiders who keep the insiders straight, but now leading journalists are courted by politicians, studied by scholars, and known to millions through their bylines and televised images. The researchers concluded that for the journalists, the source selections, summaries of news stories, and themes appearing in their fictional narratives all suggest that their conscious opinions are reflected to some degree in the ways they subconsciously structure reality. To counteract this bias, the researchers recommended a heterogeneous newsroom where competing views of all stripes lessen the chance that any one perspective will be taken for granted. Indeed. And yet, the trends the sociologists noted in 1986 have only accelerated today. In 1984, 26% of journalists voted for Ronald Reagan. By 2014, just 7% of journalists identified as Republican. By 2015, 96% of journalists who made donations to a political campaign contributed to Hillary Clinton. When researchers from Arizona State University and Texas A&M University surveyed business journalists from the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg News, Associated Press, Forbes, the New York Times, Reuters, and the Washington Post in 2018, they found that just 4% had conservative political views. I think it's fair to say journalists are much more openly culturally liberal now than they were when I got into journalism, Michael Powell, a longtime New York Times reporter, told me. In some ways, journalists have always been more liberal. It's a profession that courts reformers, after all. What I think is different now is the cultural liberalism, the identity-driven politics, he explained. Powell started to notice the pattern in the last 10 to 15 years. There were these longer-term trends because you were getting an ever more college-educated and at these bigger papers, more elite-educated workforce, he said, though this cultural liberalism didn't translate into an economically left vision. It was focused on racial justice and how that manifested as a set of cultural principles more than anything else. But the difference between journalists and the nation whose story they are tasked with telling goes beyond being liberal. A 2007 survey of 1,000 American journalists found that compared to the general public, more than twice as many journalists identified as non-religious. 44% of journalists said they didn't practice religion, while just 20% of Americans surveyed in the U.S. Census that year said the same. And even among those journalists who did identify as religious, the percentage who said religion is very important to them was significantly lower than it was for Americans overall, at 36% and 61% respectively. The survey also found that the less local and more national the media outlet, the less religious its masthead was likely to be. Back in the day when national media outlets were dwarfed by the number of local television and radio stations, papers, and magazines, you could count on a sizable number of journalists to still be living in smaller American cities, some of them attending church and synagogue alongside their readers, viewers, and listeners. Not so today. With the collapse of the local newspaper industry, American journalism is not just nationalized, but also focalized in just 3 or 4 cities, and not just any cities. The cities where the most journalists are still employed tend to be strong liberal bastions. As Jack Schafer and Tucker Doherty put it in a 2017 data analysis of the media bubble in Politico, if you're a working journalist, odds aren't just that you work in a pro-Clinton county. Odds are that you reside in one of the nation's most pro-Clinton counties. Schafer and Doherty cross-referenced labor statistics against voting patterns and U.S. Census data to uncover an almost completely sequestered media. 73% of all internet publishing jobs are in the Boston, New York, Washington, Richmond corridor, or a West Coast crescent running from Seattle to San Diego and on to Phoenix. Just 22% go to the rest of the country. Moreover, write Schafer and Doherty, almost all the real growth of internet publishing is happening outside the heartland in just a few urban counties, all places that voted for Clinton. So when conservatives use media as synonymous with liberal, they're not far off the mark. The contrast with their fellow Americans is staggering. 57% of Americans have never lived outside their home states. The typical American lives 18 miles from their mother, the New York Times reported. This great economic, national, religious, and political sequestering of the news used to be impossible because the industry was based on local ads and local news. You couldn't write the news of Boise, Idaho from New York City. Nor could you get a Boise project manager to care about the local news happening in San Francisco. But the local newspaper industry has collapsed over the past decade. U.S. newsrooms have laid off half their employees since 2008. 22,000 journalism jobs disappeared between 2006 and 2012, a third of the total workforce. With many people choosing to get their news from the internet, ad sales plummeted and could no longer sustain newsrooms. In 2005, the total ad revenue for print journalism came in at $50 billion, which sustained 55,000 reporters and editors. By 2016, that revenue had fallen to $20 billion, leaving just 33,000 jobs. Today, that number is even smaller. And as websites like Craigslist obviated classified ads and the local newspaper industry became unable to sustain itself, much of the news media migrated online. The number of digital media jobs began to rise, which meant that much of America's journalism ended up in New York, Washington, D.C., and the West Coast, where digital headquarters are located and where a bias for national news about the political, entertainment, business, and banking communities, in short, the news of the elites, has become the norm. You don't need to be a Republican campaign strategist to grasp just how far the media bubble has drifted from the average American experience, write Schafer and Doherty. But people who live in major cities aren't just more liberal, educated, and irreligious than their fellow Americans. If they're employed as journalists, they are also richer. Of course, not all journalists are rich. Many are struggling, especially freelancers trying to make it in the gig economy version of journalism. But even to struggle to make it as a journalist today, you need a backup plan or source of income, a partner who can pick up the rent when the freelance checks don't come in, or parents willing to support you a little while longer, or a side hustle that pays the bills. You need to have gotten internships, most of them unpaid, during college, something out of reach for the vast majority of college students paying their own way, who are already working 1 or 2 jobs in addition to going to class. You need to be able to spend the summers, 3 long months, at an internship that pays $1,000 if you're lucky, while living in a place like New York City, where the average rent for a studio dwarfs that amount in a single month. And more often than not, today's journalists have shelled out $70,000 for a graduate degree in journalism, even though journalism is not actually a profession but a trade, something you shouldn't need a credential to practice because it can't be taught at school. You can only learn it by doing the work. Those digital media jobs located in the most expensive cities in America pay entry-level wages of $35,000 to $40,000 a year. Because that's not a living wage in these cities, more often than not, someone else is paying the rent for these young journalists. In other words, journalism is now a rich kid's job. Most of these kids would die if you knew how rich they were, one journalist with working-class roots employed at a top newspaper told me. And when you consider that employment in digital newsrooms increased by 82% between 2008 and 2018, you begin to understand that there hasn't just been a generational replacement in the industry, but an economic and a class one too. And as it turns out, you don't just need a college education or the $70,000 in tuition for a prestigious graduate program in journalism or family wealth to carry you through the lean years. To make it as a journalist in a rapidly contracting field, you have to go to the best schools and the best graduate programs where you will make the right contacts and become part of the right networks. This is what a recent survey discovered. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal recruit their summer interns from the top 1% of universities in the country. The survey came in response to an awkward tweet by Theodore Kim, the director of newsroom fellowships and internships at the New York Times, where he wrote what he called his own super unscientific opinion on which U.S. schools turn out the most consistently productive candidates. Kim listed 4 as the best: Columbia, Northwestern, UC Berkeley, and Yale. Then he added a few subsequent tweets with honorable mentions. The tweet exposed more than the New York Times might have wished. UC Berkeley, Columbia, and Yale charge $70,000 for a journalism degree. Northwestern comes in a bit lower at about $60,000. In listing these schools as those that churn out the most consistently productive candidates, Kim said the quiet part out loud. He, as the gatekeeper to the internship program at the New York Times, the most desirable pathway to success in an ever more competitive field, was admitting that unless you come from the kind of background that can pay $70,000 for a vanity degree, you need not apply. Certainly at the New York Times and the Washington Post, they take from the very top schools, Ivy League plus Stanford and maybe Michigan for internships and that sort of thing, Powell told me. Not surprisingly, it turns out that the super unscientific opinion of the New York Times gatekeeper was a pretty good reflection of how he made decisions about who to let in the gates. 65% of the 150 news interns who worked at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, NPR, Politico, and the Chicago Tribune in the summer of 2018 came from a tiny group of highly selective universities. For the New York Times, the figures were even worse. 75% of its 32 summer interns in 2018 came from intensively selective universities, while 1 in 5 came from the top 1% of America's colleges. The numbers for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR were not much better. And it's not just the interns. Another recent survey, this one published in the Journal of Expertise in March of 2018, found similar evidence of a growing caste system in journalism among New York Times and Wall Street Journal employees. It found that half of the journalists working at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal had attended an elite school. Only a handful of select schools feed the mastheads of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, suggesting the importance of networks, the researchers concluded. Elite journalists resemble senators, billionaires, and World Economic Forum attendees in terms of educational attainment. Of course, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal aren't the totality of American journalism, nor are the Washington Post or NPR or the Los Angeles Times. But even the poorly paid digital journalism jobs whose employees hope one day to be promoted to the top tier are similarly staffed with highly educated millennials who, should they manage to scrape by for a decade or so with the help of family and friends and make it up the ladder, can be assured of making a much higher salary than the average American. And as journalism jobs are harder and harder to come by, the percentage of journalism jobs that pay the same middle-class salary as your average American makes represents a smaller and smaller share. Journalists know that if they can make it in journalism, they won't be making low salaries for very long, in addition to the status the job confers. This too is something James Fallows pointed out back in 1996. It is hard to generalize about an occupation that contains both Diane Sawyer, who is paid $7 million a year by ABC, and the reporter in Wichita who earns $24,000, which is less than Sawyer gets per working day, Fallows wrote. He went on. The people at the top of the income scale are clearly not typical of today's journalism, but they are representative of it, since they set the standard others envy and aspire to, and since they dominate the face that journalism presents to the public. Despite the majority of reporters who are underpaid, the business as a whole has carried out a successful social climb since World War II. This colors the way they live their daily lives and the issues they choose to stress. It is a major problem that journalists have come to identify with the rich or upper middle class rather than with the poor, Charles Peters, editor of the Washington Monthly, has said. It has a tremendous effect on what they're interested in reporting. Because they are identifying up, their first thought is how the situation would look from the top, rather than how it would look from the bottom. In other words, there's a simple reason why Americans feel so alienated from the media and journalists who are supposed to be writing the first draft of American history. The reason is because they are alienated from them.
And that was Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And let's see, the name again is Batya Unger Sargon. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.